I speak to you now from a place where victory no longer makes noise, from a place where crowns are heavy and memories are heavier. I am no longer young. The wind no longer asks permission when it touches my skin. The desert knows me well enough to be honest. I have one eye open to the past and one eye closed forever. They will tell you I was a queen. They will tell you I ruled. They will tell you I fought an empire. That is not where my story begins. It begins with heat, with the kind of heat that does not threaten, it decides. The kind of heat that teaches a child very early whether she will bend or whether she will remain. I was not raised in marble halls. I was raised where the land cracks beneath your feet and dares you to complain, where iron screams before it becomes useful, where women learn to measure their breath because no one will slow the world for them. Before Rome learned my name, before men whispered it with discomfort, before history tried to make me small, I was already being watched, not praised, not protected, watched because in my land, strength that announces itself is ignored. Only strength that survives silence is remembered. I remember the first time I understood that the world does not belong to those who speak the loudest. It belongs to those who endure the longest. Long nights beneath a sky crowded with stars, listening to elders speak of gods who do not save, only weigh, gods who do not reward tears, only restraint, gods who look at a woman and ask not, "What do you want?" but "What can you carry?" I learned the answer to that question before I ever wore a crown. I learned it from fire, from iron, from a river that gives life and takes it back without apology. And when the North finally looked south, when an empire decided to measure my land, it believed it was approaching silence. It was wrong. It was approaching a woman who had already been shaped by everything Rome could never understand. If you are listening to me now, in the quiet of your night, with the world softened around you, tell me softly, where in the world are you listening from? And listen carefully, because what comes next is not the story Rome wrote. It is the story Rome remembers. Before anyone called me queen, my body learned the rules of the land. The morning did not arrive gently where I was born. It came with weight, with light that pressed down on your eyelids and demanded that you rise, whether you were ready or not. Children elsewhere are eased into the world. In my land, the world arrives fully formed and asks only one question. Can you stand inside me without breaking? I learned to walk early, not because I was encouraged, but because the ground did not wait. The sand burned by mid-morning. It burned without anger, without cruelty, simply because that was its nature. And so pain was never a drama to us. It was information. You learned how long you could endure it. You learned when to shift your weight. You learned when silence was stronger than complaint. I watched other children cry. I did not judge them, but I watched what happened afterward. The land did not soften. The sun did not dim. Life simply continued. That was my first lesson in power. Not everyone is meant to be spared. Women rose before the heat thickened. Their movements were economical, practiced, quiet, no wasted gestures, no unnecessary words. I followed them everywhere. I watched how they carried water, not hunched, not hurried, but balanced, as if the weight belonged there. I watched how they listened when men spoke, not submissively, selectively. They learned early what could be ignored. No one ever told me. Watch carefully, but I did, and people noticed when a child watches too much. They tested me without ceremony. They let me fail without comfort. They corrected me without softness. They withheld approval until it was no longer needed. This was not cruelty. This was inheritance. In Kush, women are not raised to be admired. They are raised to be reliable. The furnaces were never far. Even when you could not see them, you could hear them. The low breathing of fire, the rhythmic strike of metal meeting will. Iron defined our days. It defined our nights. I remember standing at the edge of the furnace pit, the heat rising in visible waves, the air thick enough to feel like cloth against my skin. My eyes burned, my throat tightened. Someone told me to step back. I did not. Fire does not respect hesitation, and neither did I. I learned to read the men who worked there, their scars, their silences, the way they trusted their tools more than words. Iron does not lie. If struck poorly, it fractures. If rushed, it weakens. If treated with patience, it becomes something that outlasts the hand that shaped it. That lesson stayed with me longer than any prayer. At night, the city softened, but never slept. Smoke thinned into the dark. Stars emerged slowly, as if cautious. Stories moved from mouth to mouth, not myths meant to entertain, but memories meant to warn. I lay near the elders and listened. They spoke of queens whose names were never written, of women who ruled while men pretended not to notice until they needed them. They spoke of gods who watched more than they intervened. Our gods are not sentimental. They do not rescue the careless. They do not excuse the weak. They measure, they weigh, and when balance is lost, they allow the world to correct itself. That understanding shaped my soul. I did not grow up believing I was protected. I grew up believing I was responsible. The Nile confirmed everything. I watched it endlessly, its surface calm, almost indifferent, its depth unreadable. It gave life generously, and took it back without explanation. Villages flourished where it chose to stay. Others vanished where it withdrew. No negotiation, no apology. That is how authority behaves when it is real. Slowly, without announcement, I felt the shift. People began to pause when I entered a space, not bowing, not saluting, pausing, as if something in the air required adjustment. Children grew quieter. Women glanced toward me without knowing why. Men measured their words more carefully. I did not claim that moment. You never claim what is meant to settle. You let it arrive on its own. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late to undo. The land had chosen, and when the North eventually turned its attention toward us, when distant ambitions began to drift like dust on the horizon, I was no longer a child learning endurance. I was a woman shaped by heat, trained by silence, and trusted by a land that had never bent for anyone. There is a moment in every life when childhood ends without permission. It does not arrive with ceremony. It arrives quietly, often when no one is watching. For me, it arrived in the shape of expectation, not spoken, felt. I remember the first time an order was given in my presence, and the speaker looked at me afterward, as if waiting to see whether I would agree. I had not spoken. I had not moved. But something in the air had shifted. That is how authority first reveals itself, not through command, but through anticipation. From then on, I was no longer allowed the innocence of distance. I was drawn into decisions not meant for my age, not formally, casually, as if it were obvious I belonged there. I listened, as disputes were weighed, as resources were divided, as punishments were decided with faces that showed nothing. No one asked me what I thought. They watched whether I understood. Understanding, I learned, is more valuable than opinion. The women changed toward me first. They stopped correcting me publicly. They began correcting others privately. They gave me tasks that had no clear outcome, problems without guidance, situations without instruction. This is how you test judgment. I was sent to observe rather than act, to remember rather than react, to return and speak only what mattered. At night, alone, I felt the weight of it settle into my chest. Not fear, responsibility. Responsibility is heavier than fear because it does not allow escape. I learned to sit with discomfort without showing it, to hold my breath while others argued, to let silence stretch long enough that truth had nowhere left to hide. The furnaces continued their work, indifferent to human growth. I returned to them often. Fire had become familiar by then, not comforting, but honest. It did not care who you were. It responded only to how you approached it. I stood closer than most, close enough that my skin hardened, that my body learned where pain ended and damage began. Men noticed, but said nothing. Men speak when threatened. They stay silent when impressed. One evening, an older woman took my hands and turned them toward the light. She traced the marks forming there, not scars yet, but promises of them. You will not be delicate, she said quietly, not as warning, as fact. I did not argue. Delicacy had never been offered to me. The gods remained distant. We honored them without expectation. Offerings were given without pleading. Our prayers were acknowledgments, not requests. We see you. We know you see us. We will carry our part. That understanding anchored me. When grief arrived, as it always does, I watched how others carried it. No collapse. No prolonged spectacle. Tears were allowed. Indulgence was not. Loss was folded into life, not displayed as proof of virtue. I learned then that strength is not loud. It is consistent. Slowly, I felt something else awaken. Not ambition, not hunger, clarity. I began to see patterns in people, in seasons, in moments when action mattered, and moments when restraint ruled. Clarity is dangerous. It makes hesitation impossible. The Nile rose and fell. The land breathed. Life continued. And somewhere far beyond our horizon, without my knowing when exactly, the world began to lean toward us, not yet in threat, not yet in war, but in attention. Attention is always the first wound. I felt it before anyone named it. Attention beneath ordinary days. A subtle tightening in conversations. A pause before certain words. The North had begun to think of us, and thinking, in the language of empires, is the beginning of desire. I did not speak of it yet. There is a time to prepare, and a time to reveal that preparation has already occurred. I was still becoming, but the land had nearly finished shaping me. There is a moment when people stop watching you and begin waiting for you. It is subtle, almost polite. I remember when it happened to me. There was a dispute, small, ordinary, the kind that usually dissolves into noise and stubbornness. Water routes, boundaries between families. Nothing worthy of memory, they would have said. They were wrong. Those moments Decide who you will become. Voices rose, hands gestured. The air thickened with certainty from men who believed certainty was the same as wisdom. I stood at the edge of the gathering, as I always did. Not hidden, not central, present. I listened longer than comfort allowed. People mistake endurance for passivity. They forget that silence is often a form of pressure. At some point, the arguing exhausted itself. Words lost their force. And one by one, without planning to, they turned toward me. Not all at once. First one glance, then another. Expectation settled like dust. I did not rush to fill it. I asked one question, only one. What happens after? They paused. They had not thought that far. I let the pause deepen. I let it become uncomfortable. Then I spoke, not loudly, not slowly, but clearly. I traced the consequence of each option, not emotionally, practically. Who would suffer first? Who would retaliate? Which wound would spread? I did not argue. I outlined reality. When I finished, there was no reaction at first, no applause, no protest, just stillness. Then someone said, "She is right." Not agreeable, not clever, right. The decision followed without debate, and something inside the room rearranged itself permanently. Afterward, no one thanked me, no one praised me. They simply began to include me. In the days that followed, I noticed the shift everywhere. A question redirected toward me. A task entrusted without explanation. A silence held, waiting. This is how authority roots itself. Not through declaration, but through repetition. I did not celebrate it. Power that tastes sweet is already dangerous. Instead, I watched myself. I measured my words more carefully. I learned when to speak, and when to let others arrive at the same conclusion alone. That skill matters more than command. I saw how easily people surrendered thought when relieved of responsibility. I saw how eagerly they followed clarity. That frightened me, because clarity can be used to save or to dominate. The land offered no guidance on morality, only consequence. I returned to the Nile that night and sat alone, listening to water move in darkness. I asked no God for instruction. I asked myself a harder question. What kind of power will I become? There was no answer yet, only resolve. From that night on, my childhood ended completely. I was no longer merely shaped by the land. I had begun, quietly, to shape others. And somewhere beyond the desert, beyond the reach of our fires and stories, an empire was learning the same lesson. That attention, once given, is rarely withdrawn. That what is noticed is eventually tested. The North had not yet moved, but it had begun to look, and when it finally did, it would not see a child of sand and fire. It would see something it had never learned how to name. A woman already obeyed. There are decisions that educate you, and there are decisions that mark you. Until that moment, my authority had been quiet, accepted, undramatic. That is the kind of power people tolerate easily. But tolerance ends the moment consequence arrives. It was not a great crisis. History prefers disasters, but reality is shaped by smaller, sharper things. A theft, livestock taken at night, accusations whispered before sunrise. Anger travels faster than truth. Two families stood facing one another, beneath a sky already warming, their words brittle with certainty. Each believed itself wronged. Each carried witnesses. Each demanded judgment. The elders looked tired. Tired men cling to precedent. They repeat what has been done before because invention requires energy they no longer have. I listened, not to the accusations, to the rhythm beneath them. Fear, pride, the need to be seen as unbroken. Someone turned toward me, not deliberately, instinctively. "What do you see?" an elder asked. Not "what do you think?" What do you see? That question cannot be answered without cost. I asked for silence. It came. Not obedience yet, but curiosity. I asked each side to speak again, slowly, without interruption. And as they did, the shape of the truth emerged, not clean, not heroic, but familiar. The theft was real. The reason was hunger. The retaliation would not end with apology. If left unresolved, it would harden into something that would demand blood later. I weighed the options. Mercy would be seen as weakness. Severity would ignite vengeance. Balance is never clean. I chose consequence. The livestock would be returned. Compensation would be given not by the family, but by the community. And the thief would be exiled. Not forever, long enough to understand absence. A murmur spread. Exile is worse than punishment in our land. It is silence without witnesses. The mother cried out, not loudly, quietly. That sound reached me more deeply than any shout. I held her gaze and did not change the decision. Because leadership does not end where empathy begins. It begins where empathy must be carried without surrender. The elders confirmed it. The sentence was carried out before nightfall. No spectacle, no cruelty, just departure. That night, I did not sleep. The land was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I replayed the moment again and again, not the decision, but the look in her eyes. Power is not proven in command. It is proven in what you can live with afterward. I understood something then that no one teaches. You do not grow stronger by choosing correctly. You grow stronger by accepting the cost of being wrong and still standing. From that night on, people stopped debating my presence. They debated my decisions. That is the moment authority becomes real, because disagreement means you matter. I carried the weight of that exile for years, not as regret, as memory. Memory sharpens judgment better than fear ever could. And slowly, subtly, something else changed. When danger was sensed, not proven, not visible, eyes turned toward me. When messengers arrived breathless from distant paths, they spoke to me first. When silence followed bad news, it was my silence they watched. The land had finished shaping my spine. It had begun testing it. And far beyond our borders, where stone roads cut through foreign soil, where men believed the world could be organized into obedience, that same pressure was building. They did not know my name yet, but they were already approaching its shadow. Fear does not arrive screaming. It arrives as adjustment, as a pause that lasts a breath longer than necessary, as a glance exchanged too quickly to be innocent, as a sentence that is not finished. I noticed it first in the messengers. They returned from the northern paths, with their mouths dry and their words overly precise. Men who had crossed deserts without complaint now hesitated before speaking, as if language itself had become unreliable. They said nothing alarming. That was the danger. "They are building," one said. "Who?" another asked. "Men," he replied. "Men." As if that were explanation enough. I asked where. He pointed north, toward the place where the land begins to feel watched. I did not react. Reaction feeds rumor. Stillness feeds truth. That night, I climbed the low rise beyond the city, where the wind has no patience for secrets. Fires burned below like restrained thoughts. The Nile moved somewhere in the dark, unseen but present. I listened. Not for sound, for pattern. Fear has a rhythm. So does preparation. In the days that followed, small things changed. Scouts were posted earlier than usual. Supplies were counted more carefully. Paths that had always been open were suddenly considered. No one announced these changes. They happened around me. That is when I understood something critical. I was no longer being shaped for power. Power was shaping itself around me. People brought me problems before they became urgent. They asked what they should notice, what they should remember. I did not give orders. I gave attention. Watch the roads that disappear at dawn, I said. Notice who asks questions twice. Count what does not belong. They listened. Not because I was feared, but because I was precise. Precision is calming in times of uncertainty. I spent long hours alone then, walking the perimeter of the land that had raised me, touching stone, letting sand slip through my fingers, feeling how far silence traveled before it broke. This land had taught me endurance. Now it was teaching me anticipation. There is a moment before violence, when the world grows unnaturally tidy, when possibilities narrow, when choices become fewer but clearer. That moment had arrived. I knew it not because of reports, but because of my body. Sleep grew lighter. Hunger came earlier. The air felt heavier, as if waiting for instruction. I did not speak of war. War spoken too early becomes fantasy. Instead, I spoke of readiness, of remembering old paths, of sharpening what already existed, of listening more than speaking. The elders watched me closely, some with approval, some with unease. A woman who prepares without permission unsettles men who prefer warning. I did not need their comfort. I needed their compliance. One evening, an elder said quietly, "If they come—" He did not finish. I answered him, without looking away from the fire. "They will not find confusion." That was all. It was enough. From that moment on, no one asked if there would be conflict. They asked when. And in asking that question, they surrendered the last illusion of peace. I felt the weight settle fully then, not as excitement, not as dread, as inevitability. Some people are born for continuity. Others are born for rupture. I had been shaped not to preserve the world as it was, but to decide what would survive its breaking. The land knew this, the people knew it, and far away, beyond deserts and rivers, where straight roads cut into soil that never consented, something else was awakening. An appetite. It would come south believing it was expanding order. It would not understand that it was entering memory, and memory does not negotiate easily. There is a night when uncertainty leaves you, not because answers arrive, but because questions no longer matter. That night came without omen. No thunder, no sudden messenger, no cry in the dark, only a stillness so complete that even the insects seemed to hold their breath. I remember standing outside the city walls, where the ground slopes gently downward, and the sky feels closer than it should. The moon was thin, careful, as if it did not wish to be noticed. I stood there alone for a long time, not thinking, not planning, listening to the land decide. Some truths cannot be reasoned into existence. They rise slowly from beneath you. The way heat rises from stone long after the sun has set. I felt it in my spine. War was no longer a possibility. It was a condition, not declared, not chosen, accepted. I returned to the city without urgency. Urgency betrays fear. I moved as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Inside the council space, men spoke more quietly than usual. They watched me from the corners of their eyes, as if waiting for permission to admit what they already knew. No one asked, "Are we going to fight?" That question belonged to the past. They asked instead, "How much time do we have? What must be protected first? What must be allowed to burn?" Those are not questions for a child. They are not even questions for a ruler who seeks approval. They are questions asked of someone who has already been chosen by circumstance. I answered them slowly, not with certainty, with honesty. Time would be measured in weeks, not months. Borders were illusions. People were not. Some things must be sacrificed early, so that greater things survive later. No one argued. That silence was heavier than any agreement. Later, alone again, I allowed myself one moment of doubt, not fear of defeat, fear of transformation. Because war does not ask whether you are ready. It changes you, regardless. I knew what awaited me was not glory. It was narrowing. Choices would become brutal. Mercy would grow expensive. Clarity would begin to cost lives. I placed my hand on the earth and pressed my palm flat, as if grounding myself in something older than consequence. "This is where I come from," I whispered. "This is what I carry." The land did not answer. It never does. But it did not withdraw either. That was enough. By morning, preparation was no longer quiet, not loud, but visible. Paths were cleared and obscured at the same time. Weapons were moved, not displayed. Messages travelled without ceremony. There was no frenzy, only purpose. I watched the people of Kush move with the calm of those who know that survival is not dramatic. It is methodical. That morning, a woman approached me with her child. She did not ask for protection. She did not beg. She simply said, "Tell me where to send him." That sentence stays with me. Not how to save him. Not will he live. Where? I told her. She did not question it. When she turned away, I felt the final weight settle fully onto my shoulders. A queen is not crowned by ceremony. She is crowned the moment others entrust her with what they love most. From that day on, there was no version of the future in which I was not at the center of what came next. The North had not yet crossed our land, but it had already crossed a more dangerous line. It had made itself inevitable, and inevitability demands response. I did not rage against it. I did not glorify it. I simply prepared to meet it, with everything my land had spent a lifetime building inside me. This was the end of becoming. The next time I speak, I will no longer speak as a woman shaped by her land. I will speak as the land itself, answering the world. The first contact did not arrive with banners. It arrived with absence. A scout who did not return by dawn. A fire that should have been visible from the ridge but was not. A path that no longer felt empty, only quiet in a way that listens back. I felt it before it was reported. That is the curse of preparation. Your body learns the truth faster than language can carry it. I ordered nothing aloud. Orders echo. Movement whispers. We moved before sunrise. when the land still belongs to memory. Feet wrapped, metal dulled, breath measured. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to decide. The desert is honest at night. It reveals sound. It reveals intention. We followed the broken places, the reeds pressed the wrong way, the dust that had been disturbed and then carefully smoothed, the stones that remembered weight. They were close, closer than expected. I raised my hand. Everything stopped, not because I demanded it, but because they trusted the pause. Ahead, beyond a shallow rise, there was a shape that did not belong to the land. Too straight, too regular, a geometry that insulted sand. Foreign. I watched them from shadow. Men armored for certainty. Faces hidden behind discipline. Movements synchronized, precise, confident in the belief that precision is protection. They did not see us. That was their first loss. I studied how they stood when they thought no one watched. How they drank. How they laughed too loudly at nothing. How they assumed distance made them untouchable. I did not hate them. Hatred narrows vision. I needed clarity. I withdrew us without sound. First contact does not demand blood. It demands understanding. Back within our lines, I spoke for the first time that night. They believe the night belongs to them, I said. It does not. No cheers followed. Only readiness. Training changed immediately. Archers learned to breathe with the wind rather than against it. Steps were timed to heartbeats. Signals were reduced to gestures so small they would escape fear. Elephants were moved farther south, hidden where patience is natural. They are not weapons of surprise, they are weapons of memory. I walked among the people without guard. That mattered. A leader who hides teaches fear. A leader who walks teaches steadiness. A young man approached me with a question he did not know how to ask. "Will they come tonight?" he said. I answered honestly, "Not yet." He nodded, relieved, and then something else crossed his face. "And when they do," I met his eyes. "They will come into a land that has already decided how to receive them." That was enough. The second contact was blood, not a battle, a cut. One of our scouts was discovered at the edge of their perimeter. He did not run. He waited until he was seen. They struck him down quickly, efficiently. They left his body where it fell. A message. We recovered him before sunrise. No wailing, no ceremony. We wrapped him in cloth and returned him to the earth he knew. His name was spoken once. That is how you honor someone whose duty is complete. That morning, I stood before the people, not elevated, not shielded. I did not describe what had happened. They already felt it. "From this moment," I said, "nothing here is accidental. Paths, silences, delays. Everything will be chosen. We will not rush. We will not chase. We will let them step forward, believing they advance. And we will decide where that belief ends." No one asked how long it would take. Time no longer mattered. Only placement. That night, as the fires dimmed and the stars pressed close again, I allowed myself one breath of something like grief. Not for the dead scout alone, for the narrowing ahead. War compresses the soul. It sharpens you by removing everything unnecessary. I knew what I would lose. I accepted it. The land had taught me endurance. Now it demanded precision. And far beyond our lines, behind straight roads and rigid formations, an empire had just learned a dangerous lesson. We were not asleep. We were listening. There is a difference between violence that happens and violence that is invited. The first is chaos. The second is control. I chose the place, not because it was narrow, but because it was forgettable, a shallow bend where the land appears generous, flat enough to encourage confidence, uneventful enough to lull discipline into habit. That is where empires relax. We waited there without impatience. Waiting is not absence of action. It is pressure applied slowly. The night stretched, breath slowed. Even the animals learned to move elsewhere. I stood among the archers, close enough to feel the tension in their shoulders. I did not speak to them. They did not need instruction. They needed permission to trust what they already knew. The wind shifted. I felt it against my cheek, carrying the scent of leather and metal foreign, orderly, certain. They came as expected, not rushing, not alert, confident. Their formation loosened slightly as they crossed the bend. Shields lowered, voices softened. One of them laughed. That sound decided everything. I raised 2 fingers. Nothing happened. I raised one. The world inhaled. Then the arrows moved, not as a storm, as punctuation. Each release measured, each breath aligned. We did not aim to overwhelm. We aimed to unbalance. The first man fell without understanding why. The second turned just in time to see the shape of his fear. Shields lifted too late. Orders collided. Confusion is louder than any weapon. They tried to regroup. That was their second mistake. Our arrows did not chase. They waited. Every step they took to restore order cost them certainty. Then the ground betrayed them. Not dramatically, subtly. A step that slid. A turn that lagged. Fear does not need spectacle. It only needs doubt. I moved forward then. Not into the light, into the edge of it. They saw me only briefly, a figure where none should be. Still where motion was expected. One of them shouted a command. Another contradicted it. That was enough. We withdrew as we had come, without triumph, without pursuit. They were left with bodies, questions, and a silence that no drill could correct. We did not count the dead. Counting distracts. We counted time. How long before they moved again? How long before confidence hardened into caution? Back within our lines, no one celebrated. Celebration reveals hunger. I walked alone to the river and washed my hands, not of blood, but of decision, because that night something changed. Not in them, in me. I felt the narrowing begin. Choices grew sharper. Mercy grew heavier. I understood then that war is not a series of battles. It is a re-education. You teach the enemy what to expect, and then you teach them how wrong they are. By dawn, messengers reported what I already knew. Their patrols slowed. Their spacing tightened. Their voices sharpened with restraint. They had learned. Good. A thinking enemy is predictable. A confident one is not. I gathered the leaders quietly. No speeches. No maps drawn in haste. I spoke only this. They will now move as if watched. I let that settle. And they should. That was the first night Rome bled on our terms. Not enough to alarm the world. Enough to change behavior. Enough to begin memory. And memory, once formed, is difficult to erase. The land exhaled. Not relief. Approval. This was how it wanted to be defended. Without noise, without apology, without illusion. I returned to the people before sunrise. Some avoided my eyes. Some sought them. Both reactions were correct. A leader must be seen and withstood. There was no crown yet, no title spoken aloud, but something irreversible had happened. From that night on, I was no longer preparing for war. I was conducting it. After the first chosen blood, we did not press forward. That restraint confused them more than pursuit ever could. Empires are trained to respond to force with force. When force does not arrive, they invent explanations, and most of those explanations flatter themselves. They believed we were testing. They believed we would now reveal ourselves. They were wrong. We let nights pass untouched. Then we returned, not to strike, to disrupt. A sentry would swear he heard movement and find nothing. A supply cart would arrive lighter than it had departed, with no sign of theft. Footprints would appear at dawn and vanish by noon. We did not kill every time. Killing teaches respect. Absence teaches fear. I learned quickly that men fear uncertainty more than pain. Pain can be trained against. Uncertainty erodes discipline from within. I ordered that no pattern repeat itself. One night, arrows fell without warning. The next, nothing happened at all. Another night, a single horn sounded far from any camp, and then went silent. They began to sleep badly. I knew this not from reports, but from posture. Men who sleep poorly hold their shoulders differently. They listen too hard. They grip weapons that have not yet been threatened. Their commanders tightened control, tighter formations, shorter patrols, more rules. Rules feel like safety to those who believe the world can be commanded. Rules are also brittle. We pressed on the edges. A path used every night suddenly became dangerous. Another, long abandoned, turned safe. They adjusted. We waited, then shifted again. This was not cruelty. It was education. We were teaching them the land does not belong to those who measure it. It belongs to those who remember it. The people watched me differently now. Not with awe, with calibration. They wanted to know how far I would go. That is always the question beneath loyalty. I made sure they saw restraint as often as resolve. Villages were moved quietly. Food stores redistributed without announcement. Children sent south before panic could infect them. A woman asked me if we would burn the fields. No, I said. We will let them think we might. Fear that remains theoretical is more useful than fear that is confirmed. I did not sleep much then. Not because of worry, but because my mind had begun to operate differently. Time compressed. Choices simplified. War narrows the world until only consequence remains. I accepted that narrowing. One night, as I walked the perimeter, a young archer fell into step beside me without asking permission. They are afraid, he said. Yes, I answered. They are angry, he added. Yes, he hesitated. They are learning. I stopped walking. So did he. Good, I said. Let them. Learning leads to mistakes. Mistakes reveal themselves to those who wait. And the mistake came sooner than I expected. They began to chase us. Not carefully, not thoughtfully. They believed they had discerned our rhythm. They believed we were avoiding open ground. They believed pressure would force revelation. That belief was a gift. I allowed it to grow. Scouts retreated just enough to be seen. Tracks were left imperfectly erased. Signals were allowed to be noticed. Confidence returned thin, but eager. They moved deeper, farther from certainty, farther from supply, farther from the comfort of formation. When the reports reached me, I felt no excitement, only alignment. This was the moment war offers you once. The moment when your enemy believes he understands you. I gathered the leaders and spoke plainly. They will advance tomorrow night, I said, not cautiously. No one asked how I knew. Knowing had become expected. I did not describe what would happen. Descriptions invite fear. Clarity invites trust. Remember this, I told them. Tonight decides whether they continue believing this land can be corrected. The land was very still that evening, as if listening, as if approving. And as the sun fell, and the world narrowed again into shadow and breath, I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel before. Not doubt, not fear. A quiet certainty that the next blood would be heavier, because the next encounter would not be a lesson, it would be a statement. They came at night, believing the dark would hide them. That belief alone told me how little they understood this land. The desert does not hide, it reveals. Every step speaks. Every breath leaves a trace. We felt them long before we saw them. A pressure moving through the air, a tightening along the paths we had allowed them to follow. I let them advance, not because I underestimated them, but because interruption too early would have preserved their confidence. Confidence is hardest to kill. We waited until they were deep enough to doubt their maps, until formation required effort, until silence became strain. Then I gave the signal. Not with a shout, not with a horn, with absence. The fires we had allowed them to glimpse went dark all at once. Darkness fell unevenly, a darkness that moved, that breathed. They halted. That pause, that single moment of hesitation, was the hinge on which everything turned. The first arrows did not fall where they stood. They fell behind them, cutting retreat before threat. Panic is not immediate. It arrives as confusion. Orders collide. Men turn to find leaders who are no longer where they should be. That is when sound begins to fracture. I moved forward, then not into combat, but into decision. I watched patterns dissolve. A unit tried to regroup and found ground that no longer agreed with their feet. Another advanced and discovered the night had teeth. We did not press in lines. We appeared where certainty expected emptiness. The elephants moved last, not charging, emerging. Their silhouettes broke the horizon, enormous and patient, as if the land itself had chosen to stand. Men who have trained against men do not understand what to do with memory made flesh. The sound, that low, impossible sound, did more damage than tusks ever could. They broke, not all at once. Breakage is rarely dramatic. It begins with small decisions made alone. A man stepping sideways, another hesitating, another running. And once one runs, order becomes a story people tell themselves too late. We did not chase them far. Chasing teaches bravery. We let the night finish what we had begun. When dawn came, the land was quiet again. Too quiet. I walked among the aftermath without urgency. This is where leaders reveal themselves. Not in the clash, but in the accounting. We counted the living first. We tended wounds without distinction of rank. Then we counted the dead, not as trophies, as weight. I stood over bodies that would never rise again, and felt nothing that resembled triumph. Victory without restraint is intoxication. Intoxication ruins judgment. I felt instead a narrowing I could not undo. Something had sealed itself shut inside me. The woman who once asked, "What kind of power will I become?" no longer had the luxury of asking. War had answered. From that morning on, the people did not look at me as they had before. They did not look for reassurance. They looked for direction. A queen is not crowned by victory. She is crowned when others no longer imagine survival without her. I knew then this conflict would not end quickly. Rome would not retreat because of one night. Empires interpret resistance as miscalculation, never as instruction. They would return with greater force, greater certainty, greater insult, and next time the cost would not be measured only in bodies. It would be measured in me, because war had taken its first payment, not blood, but innocence, and it would come again, to collect more. After that night, the war stopped pretending. It moved closer, closer to the city, closer to the people, closer to me. Rome does not accept instruction easily. When it bleeds, it does not ask why. It asks how much more must be applied. They returned heavier. More men, more certainty, more insistence that the world obey structure. I watched their camps from distance. They built them carefully, straight lines pressed into land that resented straightness. They fortified as if stone could convince the desert to behave. They were no longer laughing. That pleased me less than it should have, because a careful enemy demands something different from you. It demands sacrifice. Our nights grew shorter, not in hours, in margin. Every decision now carried cost on both sides. Every victory narrowed our options. Villages closest to the north were emptied quietly. People moved south, carrying only what memory required. A woman asked me if she would return. I did not answer. A leader must never lie to preserve comfort. The wounded multiplied, not dramatically, steadily. Men who had walked beside me weeks earlier now lay still, their breaths shallow, their eyes fixed on nothing. I learned how blood smells when it is no longer shocking, how pain sounds when it has accepted itself. I visited them all, not because they needed me, but because I needed to remember why. That is when I noticed the change. I was no longer absorbing grief. I was cataloguing it. Names, faces, costs. War was reorganizing me, turning feeling into function. That frightened me more than Rome ever could. One night, alone, I pressed my forehead to the earth and stayed there longer than necessary. I tried to remember the girl who once watched furnaces without knowing what fire would demand of her. The memory did not come easily. Something essential had begun to slip away, and the war noticed. It always does. The pressure increased. Skirmishes grew closer to daylight. Patrols tested deeper. Supply lines became targets. Rome was adapting. So was I. Adaptation is not improvement. It is survival refined. I ordered a maneuver I would once have hesitated to consider, a delay that would cost lives now, to prevent slaughter later. The decision was correct. The cost was immediate. When the reports reached me, I read them once, then again, then folded them away. That night, I did not walk among the people. I stayed alone. A queen does not always have the right to be seen. Sometimes she must absorb what cannot be shared. It was then I understood the next truth of war. It does not only take innocence, it takes rest. Sleep became thin, dreams fractured. Even silence felt alert, as if listening for permission to break. And somewhere inside me, a line hardened. A place where hesitation used to live. That place closed. I was becoming efficient, dangerously so. The people felt it. They spoke to me with fewer words. They accepted instructions without question. Trust had become reliance. Reliance is heavier. I stood one evening watching the fires settle into embers and realized something without drama. If this war continued long enough, I would win, but I would not remain whole. And still, when dawn came, I did not retreat from that knowledge, because leadership is not choosing what you lose, it is choosing what survives. Rome had taken something from me already. Soon, it would take more, and when it did, it would finally understand what it had awakened. There is a moment when war stops being something you direct and becomes something that enters you. Mine arrived without warning, not in the center of a battle, not surrounded by noise or glory. It came in confusion. A clash too close to the city, too near the places where people still believed themselves safe. The kind of moment commanders fear, because it collapses distance. I was there because I had to be. A leader who rules only from shadow. Teaches doubt. The night had already torn itself open. Shouts overlapped. Torches broke formation. Orders arrived late and collided. This was not the kind of war we preferred. This was proximity. I moved through it with purpose, not urgency. Urgency narrows vision. Purpose steadies it. I remember turning toward a sound, metal striking stone, a cry that cut short, and then the world tilted. Not dramatically, just enough. Pain does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives as pressure, a sudden heaviness behind my eye, a warmth that did not belong. I reached up instinctively, and my hand came away darker than it should have been. Time slowed, not because of fear, but because the body demands accounting. I understood immediately. This was not a wound that could be ignored. Someone shouted my name. I silenced them with a look. Fear spreads faster than blood. I did not fall. I refused that. Falling invites panic. Standing becomes instruction. I turned away from the clash and walked toward cover. Each step required negotiation. The world narrowed to rhythm. Breath, step, will. Hands caught me before I allowed myself to stop. They laid me down where the firelight flickered weakly, as if unsure whether it should bear witness. I pressed cloth against my face and felt something essential slipping away. Not consciousness. Depth. The world flattened. Sound dulled on one side. Light fractured on the other. Pain arrived then. Full. Undeniable. Not sharp. Consuming. I did not scream. Not because I was strong, but because screaming would have broken something more fragile than bone. I heard someone whisper a prayer. I did not correct them. Even gods are allowed their illusions. When it was over, when the bleeding slowed and the noise retreated, I lay still and let the truth settle. I would not see the world the same way again. Not metaphorically, literally. That loss did something unexpected. It clarified. When you lose depth, you gain focus. The world simplifies itself. There is no softness in that, only precision. When I stood again, hours later, perhaps, the people looked at me differently. Not with pity, with awe, sharpened by fear. A queen who bleeds and does not retreat changes the shape of loyalty. I touched the bandage once and felt nothing where sensation should have been. Something had closed. Not just flesh. A door. From that moment on, war no longer threatened me. It had already taken its claim. Rome would learn what that meant, because a woman who has already paid does not negotiate the same way as one who still has something to protect. This wound did not weaken me. It completed me, and from that night forward, when I looked at the world, I did so with one eye and no illusions. When I returned to the people, I did not announce myself. I never did. But silence moved ahead of me, like a shadow that had learned my shape. They saw the bandage before they saw my face. They understood before they were told. A wound on a ruler is never private. It belongs to everyone who depends on her remaining upright. I did not speak that first night. I sat among them as the fires settled, and the embers learned how to glow without flame. I let them look. I let them measure what had been taken and what had not. They were waiting for weakness. They did not find it. Loss had changed my posture. Not smaller, stricter. The world had flattened, yes, but it had also sharpened. When you lose an eye, you lose distraction. Movement becomes intention. Sound becomes warning. Light becomes information, not comfort. I saw less. I understood more. The people adjusted quickly, too quickly. That unsettled me. Men who once spoke freely now chose words as if they might wound me further. Women watched me with a new stillness, one that was not sympathy, but calibration. They were learning how close to stand. I broke that silence the following morning. I stood without ornament, without guard, and said only this: I am not diminished. Nothing more. That sentence travelled faster than any messenger. Rome felt it before it heard it. They noticed the change immediately. Our movements became firmer, our pauses more deliberate, our responses colder. They tested us again, probing, careful, hoping the wound had opened a seam. It had, just not the one they expected. I began to allow them to see me. Not often, not clearly. A figure where no figure should be. A presence where reports said none remained. They spoke of me in their camps, not as strategy, as story. Stories infect discipline. They said I did not sleep, that I could see in darkness, that the wound had made me something other than human. I did not correct them. A leader does not rush to humanize herself to her enemy. I used the wound deliberately. I appeared at moments calculated to unsettle. I withdrew when they expected pursuit. I spoke through others, and then appeared in person, contradicting expectation. Consistency reassures. Inconsistency educates. The people felt the shift, too. They no longer asked if we would endure. They asked how far we would press. That question is dangerous. Victory invites appetite. I restrained it. We are not here to humiliate, I told them. We are here to be remembered correctly. Rome began to hesitate, not openly, but in the space between orders. Patrols slowed. Encampments grew heavier, less confident. They sent messengers, not yet with terms, with questions disguised as courtesy. I refused to answer. Negotiation offered too early is simply fear asking for permission. At night, alone, I learned my new body, how balance shifted, how turning required patience, how stillness had become my ally. I did not mourn the eye. Mourning implies regret. I regarded it as payment. War takes what it must to make you believable. And now, when I stood before my people, they did not see a woman who had been hurt. They saw a woman who had been chosen by cost. Rome had wounded me. In doing so, it had completed the thing it feared most. A ruler who no longer needed to prove anything. From that moment on, the war changed its tone. Not louder, quieter, more careful. Which is how you know the balance has shifted. Because when an empire grows careful, it has begun to doubt itself. And doubt, once learned, is far more difficult to heal than any wound of the flesh. They did not call it surrender. Empires never do. They called it discussion. The messengers arrived without armor, polished for war. Their banners were modest. Their voices trained to sound reasonable. Reason is the final uniform of those who have learned limits. I received them at dusk, not inside walls, not beneath canopies, where the land could listen. They bowed as if balance could be restored with posture. I did not return it. Courtesy offered too carefully is already an admission. They spoke of borders, of misunderstandings, of the desire for stability. Stability is what those in motion request from those who have stopped them. I listened without interruption. Listening is power when it is deliberate. When they finished, I waited. Silence stretched. They shifted their weight, adjusted their hands, glanced at one another as if searching for the next page. There was none. "You crossed into memory," I said finally. "Not territory." They did not understand at first. Men trained to draw lines believe everything is reducible to line. I continued, "This land does not negotiate its existence. Neither do I." One of them began to speak. I raised a hand. Not sharply, decisively. "You came to ask how this ends," I said. "I will tell you how it does not. It does not end with tribute. It does not end with governors. It does not end with us kneeling in exchange for quiet." Their faces remained composed. Their eyes did not. Composure is a habit. Eyes reveal training limits. "You will leave the way you came," I said, "without maps corrected by force, without standards planted in sand that rejects them." "And if we refuse?" one asked carefully. I met his gaze with the eye that still measured depth. "Then you will continue to lose men to a war you cannot finish," I said. Not dramatically, not all at once. Gradually. That word landed. Gradual loss terrifies empires. It cannot be turned into legend. I did not threaten. Threats invite defiance. I described outcome. They asked for time. Time is a currency of the wounded. I allowed it, because confidence does not fear delay. When they departed, I did not watch them leave. Watching implies concern. I returned to the city and stood among my people as night settled again. Fires burned low. Conversations moved quietly, as if unwilling to disturb a balance that had finally steadied. They did not cheer. They waited. Days passed, then weeks. Their camps thinned. Their patrols retreated. Their presence loosened its grip. Not all at once. Carefully, as if they wished to pretend this was their decision. I allowed that fiction. Victory does not require humiliation. It requires result. When confirmation arrived formal, restrained, unmistakable, I felt nothing that resembled triumph, only completion. Rome had withdrawn, not defeated, contained, and that distinction mattered. I addressed the people once more, not as a warrior, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had carried them through narrowing and loss. "We did not win because we were stronger," I said. "We won because we did not forget who we were." That night, I stood alone beneath the stars again. The way I had before the war was certain. The sky had not changed. I had power, I learned, is not what you take. It is what you refuse to surrender, even when the world insists. Rome would write its version. Empires always do, but somewhere in its memory, not its records, not its monuments, there would remain a pause, a hesitation when looking south, a reminder that not every land accepts correction, and not every woman yields when wounded. I closed my eye and listened to the land breathe. It had survived. So had I. Time does not announce its victories. It simply continues until noise grows tired of chasing it. Long after Rome withdrew, long after the camps were dismantled and the roads forgotten their straightness, I remained, not triumphant, not celebrated, present. That is the final test of power, whether it can survive its own success. The people returned slowly to the rhythms they had set aside. Fields were replanted, paths reopened. Laughter returned carefully, as if uncertain whether it was still permitted. I did not rush them. Peace, like authority, must be allowed to settle at its own pace. I walked the city more often then, not to inspect, to remember, to relearn the sound of ordinary life, the scrape of vessels, the arguments that mattered only for a moment, the quiet negotiations between fatigue and hope. They still watched me, but differently. They no longer searched my face for instruction. They searched it for continuity. That is a heavier expectation. My body never fully returned to me. Balance remained altered. Depth came slowly. Pain arrived uninvited and left when it pleased. I accepted that. A body that has paid does not demand refund. I spent long hours alone near the river again, watching it do what it has always done. Give, withdraw, remember nothing. Rivers do not honor rulers. That is why they are honest teachers. Sometimes I wondered how Rome would tell this story. I imagined their words careful, minimized, a campaign redirected, a frontier adjusted. Empires prefer explanations that preserve inevitability. Let them. Truth does not require their permission. Truth lives in what did not happen, in the governors who never arrived, in the standards that never rose, in the children who grew old, speaking our language without correction. That absence is my monument. I was never meant to be marble. I was meant to be remembered by consequence. If you listen closely now, in whatever quiet corner of the world has brought you here, you may understand something Rome did not. Power is not loud. It does not demand recognition. It does not beg to be recorded. It endures. It withdraws when it has finished its work. It leaves behind a land that still belongs to itself. I speak to you now, not as a queen, not as a warrior, but as a woman who has lived long enough to see fear change hands. Remember this, not every empire falls by force. Some are simply refused, and refusal, when carried long enough, becomes history. The night is quieter now. The land breathes. So do you. Wherever you are listening from, carry this with you into your silence. What survives does not always conquer. Sometimes it simply stands. And that is enough. Do not leave yet. Stories like this are not meant to end abruptly. They are meant to fade, the way heat fades from stone long after sunset. If you are still listening, it means something in this silence recognized you. Perhaps it was not the war, not the wound, not even the victory. Perhaps it was the idea that power does not always roar, that sometimes the strongest act is simply to remain when others expect you to disappear. I am not asking you to remember my name. Names belong to records. Records belong to those who fear forgetting. I am asking you to remember the feeling of standing firm, without witnesses, of refusing without shouting, of carrying loss, without allowing it to hollow you. If this story stayed with you, if it slowed your breath, or sharpened your attention for a moment, then it has done its work. Before you rest, before you let sleep take over, or the world rush back in, tell me quietly, just to yourself, what part of you has learned to endure without being seen, and if there are other lives, other women, other forgotten powers, you would like to walk beside in the dark. You know where to find me. I will be here, waiting.